tonight. Let's step back into the year 1315. You're not wearing sneakers, and there's no Uber Eats on the way. You're not watching a storm from behind double-glazed windows. No, you're waking up on a straw mattress, tucked under a scratchy wool blanket that smells like sheep, because it was a sheep not too long ago. Your house is made of timber and mud, with a thatched roof that leaks more than it protects. It's early spring, and the cold hasn't quite left yet. But something is off. The air smells wet. Not fresh after the rain wet, but sodden sour, the scent of mold blooming in dark corners. It's been raining for days. Weeks, actually. The kind of rain that doesn't fall in poetic bursts, but in grey sheets, drumming endlessly on the rooftops, soaking the soil and sinking hope. You throw on your tunic and step outside. Your boots sink into the mud with a sucking sound. What used to be a garden now looks like a soup of slush and wilted leaves. The chickens look confused. Your one scrawny cow is shivering under the eaves, looking at you like she blames you for the sky. It's not just your village. It's not just your region. It's all of Europe. And no one knows why. A sky that forgot how to stop. From Ireland to Germany, from France to the Low Countries, the rain just kept falling. It started in May 1315. Fields that had been ploughed with aching backs and blistered hands turned into slick swamps. Wheat refused to ripen. Barley drowned. Oats, the staple of the poor, sprouted mold right in the ground. Medieval Europe didn't have backup plans. There were no warehouses of freeze-dried rations. No refrigerated trucks bringing food from warmer lands. What you grew was what you ate. And that year, Europe grew nothing but anxiety. It wasn't just rain. It was cold, too. Chilling winds crept into barns and under clothes. Spring never warmed. Summer never arrived. The sun played hide-and-seek, and forgot to come back. They called it a little ice age, a phrase that sounds almost charming, like something from a storybook. But it wasn't charming. It was brutal. The jet stream had shifted. Volcanic eruptions may have filled the sky with ash. We'll never know for sure. What we do know, nature flipped the table. The village clock, the agricultural year. To understand the chaos, you need to understand how time worked back then. For a medieval farmer, the year wasn't measured in calendar months or quarterly reports. It was a cycle of chores tied directly to the land. Spring, ploughing and planting. Summer, tending and hoping. Autumn, harvesting and storing. Winter, surviving. Each season was a bridge to the next. If one collapsed, the whole thing fell apart. Now imagine this. You ploughed your fields in April, praying for just the right balance of sun and showers. May came, and so did the rains. Not a gentle drizzle, but relentless downpours. The seeds never sprouted. Or they did, only to be swallowed in muck. June brought more rain. By July, your neighbors were talking in hushed tones at the church steps. August, and still no harvest. You go to your pantry. You count what's left. Salted pork, gone. Grains, nearly empty. Maybe a few wrinkled turnips in a basket. Winter is still 4 months away. And no food is coming. One bad year. Try 3. Now here's the twist. This wasn't just a single bad season. The rains came in 1315, but they didn't pack up and leave in time for a recovery. 1316 was almost as bad. So was 1317. The famine lasted nearly 3 full years. Think about that for a moment. 3 years of failed crops. 3 years of starving livestock. 3 years of watching children grow thinner. 3 years of wondering if your neighbors would live to see Easter. And in the background, a church telling you that it's probably your fault. That God is punishing you. God, guilt, and weather. In the 14th century, people didn't talk about carbon emissions or climate models. They talked about divine wrath. The rain was more than just inconvenient. It was a sign. Had people sinned too much? Had kings become wicked? Had cities turned prideful? Priests gave sermons. Nobles ordered fasts. Communities held public processions, marching barefoot in the rain, begging the heavens to stop. They clutched relics. They wept. They prayed harder. But the rain didn't listen. It's easy now to look back and scoff. But imagine it. You're hungry, wet, scared, and watching your crops drown. If someone told you to walk barefoot through the village, holding a candle to save your children, you'd do it too. Hunger is a whisper first. The thing about hunger is that it doesn't scream. Not at first. At first, it whispers. A missed meal here. A smaller portion there. You tell yourself it's fine. Just a thin harvest. Just a bad season. The weather will turn. It always does. But then the children start getting sick more often. The old folks move less. The bread gets stretched thinner with each bake. More barley, more husks, more air. And still, the rain keeps falling. Drip, drip, drip. Like a ticking clock counting down to catastrophe. The quiet collapse. By autumn of 1315, there was no harvest to store. Root vegetables rotted underground. Grain sprouted early and died in the field. Hay for the animals was scarce, which meant the cows and horses, already shivering in the cold, began to die too. You couldn't just eat more meat, because livestock were precious, and now they were starving too. Horses couldn't plow in spring if they were eaten in winter. Chickens laid fewer eggs. Milk dried up. Trade didn't save you either. The roads were rivers. The rivers were mud. And even if you could reach another village, they were just as hungry as you. Markets collapsed. Coins lost meaning when bread couldn't be bought. Modern problems. Medieval setting. Let's pause for a moment and reframe this. Today, if one country's crop fails, others pitch in. We have trade, shipping, refrigeration, global reserves. But back in 1315, your food came from your dirt. If the dirt failed, your belly did too. No climate insurance. No government subsidies. No supermarket aisles. Just rain, mud, and silence. A personal catastrophe. History books will tell you numbers. How many perished, how much grain was lost. But history lived in people. A mother tucking her children under a damp blanket, pretending she isn't hungry. A farmer digging a pit to bury his third cow, knowing the others won't last the week. A monk watching the monastery stores dwindle, praying harder with every bite. The famine was not just about food. It was about fear, desperation, loss, and a creeping dread that the old rhythms of the earth had been broken. The dawn of misery. So here we are, 1315, the beginning of a famine that would reshape Europe, and this is just chapter 1. In the chapters ahead, we'll journey through the economic collapse, the moral decay, the rise in theft, rumors of cannibalism, and the long, wet road to recovery. But for now, take a breath. Let the rain fall gently in your mind. Let the fire crackle at your feet. And imagine a time when the world forgot how to feed itself. Because in 1315, Europe didn't just suffer. It starved. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing in a damp medieval field in northern Europe. The year is 1315. You're wearing a coarse wool tunic, your hands are blistered from tilling the soil, and your breath clouds in the summer air. Yes, summer air, because the wind is oddly chilly. The sky above is swollen and grey, with clouds so thick they seem to press down on your shoulders. You look up, waiting for a break in the gloom, but the sun, it seems, has called in sick again. This isn't just a bad week of weather. This is the beginning of something much stranger, something no one in your village, or your grandfather's village, has ever seen. It's as if nature itself has thrown a tantrum, flipped the calendar upside down, and whispered, "Let's see how you survive this." Welcome to the year the weather went rogue. The rain begins to fall, and won't stop. It all started innocently enough. Spring rains are normal. Farmers rely on them to soften the soil and swell the seeds. But in 1315, the rains didn't stop. By mid-May, villages across the Low Countries, France, England, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire reported flooded fields. Rivers swelled like overfilled wine skins, and roads turned into brown, sluggish streams. By June, people began to worry. Planting had been delayed, first by the endless downpours, then by mud so thick it sucked off boots and refused to let go of ox-drawn ploughs. Crops that were supposed to be knee-high were barely poking out of the earth. Grain seeds rotted underground, and the rain just kept falling. Imagine trying to grow your entire year's food supply in a season where the sky behaves like a broken faucet. No weather apps, no emergency planning, just clouds, mud, and the gnawing sense that something wasn't right. The cold that crept in. As if soaking fields weren't enough, the temperatures began to dip. Summers were supposed to be mild but warm enough for wheat to ripen, for hay to dry, and for fruits to swell with sweetness. But that year, the summer air bit like autumn. There were frosts, in July, and ice still clung to village ponds when hay should have been harvested. The sun was so shy, peasants joked that it had taken holy orders and gone into a monastery. But behind the humour lay fear. Bread was the backbone of medieval life. No bread meant no food. And in a world where over 90% of people lived off what they grew themselves, a bad harvest didn't just mean hardship. It meant hunger. It meant death. Some chroniclers would later call this a punishment from God. Others thought the devil had stirred up the heavens himself. But we, centuries later, can look at the sky and say, the weather had gone rogue, and it wasn't done yet. What was causing this chaos? Now, let's pause for a moment and zoom out, way out, up into the atmosphere. Modern science gives us some clues about what might have triggered the catastrophic weather of 1315 to 1317. The most likely culprit? A complex cocktail of volcanic activity and a dip in solar output, kicking off what climatologists call the Great Famine phase of the Little Ice Age. It's likely that somewhere in the early 14th century, maybe in New Zealand, maybe in Indonesia, an enormous volcanic eruption blasted millions of tons of ash into the stratosphere. That ash then wrapped around the planet like a gauzy veil, dimming sunlight and cooling the climate. It's kind of like Earth put on a pair of heavy sunglasses and then got cold feet about summer. On top of that, the sun itself was going through one of its many moody periods. A dip in solar activity, less heat, less light, combined with the volcanic gloom to send Europe into a climatological nosedive. But peasants in 1315 didn't know that. They only knew the weather was breaking the rules. Flooded towns and floating roofs. It wasn't just the fields that suffered. Towns along rivers were hit hard. Bridges collapsed under swollen currents. Wooden homes were swept away by flash floods. In Paris, parts of the Seine overflowed into the streets. In the Low Countries, entire stretches of farmland turned into shallow lakes. Villagers tried to cope. Ditches were dug. Drainage channels were cleared. But there's only so much you can do when your tools are wood and your labor force is made of tired, hungry people. Some towns even built makeshift levees, but they were no match for month after month of saturated soil and unrelenting rain. At night, villagers could hear the groaning of sodden beams and the distant, eerie splash of collapsing thatched roofs. Nature was not just inconvenient. It was actively hostile. Medieval mood, anxiety, superstition, and prayers. You know that weird feeling you get when it rains for too many days in a row? That creeping cabin fever, the gloom, the sluggishness? Now multiply that by 3 years and subtract electricity, entertainment, and any sense of security. By autumn, people were already rationing what little they had managed to harvest. Anxiety seeped through every parish like damp through a stone wall. Churches held special masses to beg for divine mercy. Priests marched through the streets carrying relics, hoping a saint's fingerbone or fragment of robe might appease the angry heavens. People whispered about sin, collective sin, personal sin, royal sin. Maybe the king had offended God. Maybe a local noble had committed a secret heresy. Maybe it was the Jews, or the lepers, or the witches. In times of uncertainty, blame is easy to plant. And still, the rain continued. Small creatures, big problems. As the ground stayed wet, strange things began to multiply. Slugs, worms, molds, fungi. All the damp-loving creatures that thrive in decay took over the soggy fields. Stored grain turned slimy. Hay stacks sprouted mushrooms. Food spoiled faster. Even that which was saved was barely edible. And to top it off, rats. With less grain being grown, people stored what little they had closer to home, and the rats followed, gnawing into bags, biting sleeping children and carrying disease. The storm, it seemed, wasn't just in the skies. It was creeping into every home, every cellar, every barn. The chaos of nature had slithered indoors. A storm without lightning, a crisis without end. Perhaps the strangest thing about this rogue weather wasn't just its violence, it was its persistence. It wasn't like a hurricane, a flood, or a heat wave. There was no clear beginning or end. No event to mark on a calendar. Just a slow, sodden descent into a world where nature forgot the script. The skies remained grey. The rain came and went but never stopped for long. The seasons blurred, and the people waited and prayed and began to go hungry. We often imagine history as a story of kings and wars. But here, in the endless drizzle of 1315, the greatest drama was between humans and the sky. If you're enjoying this slow unraveling of history's most unexpected disasters, don't forget to like this video and comment below. What's the longest you've ever experienced rain without a break? Could you survive a medieval summer like this? The summer of 1315 should have been a time of growth, of sunlight drying the dew from tall stalks of barley, of sheaves ripening golden in fields that waved like oceans, of laughter, perhaps, as children chased butterflies between rows of beans and cabbages. But that year, the summer betrayed them. The rain didn't stop. The skies above France, England, the Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire, they all seemed to have reached a silent agreement. No sunlight this year. Clouds thickened like wool. Temperatures dipped unnaturally low. Entire villages waited, watched, and worried. And in the fields, a slow horror began to unfold. Imagine the smell first. Rotting vegetation. Moldy soil. The scent of green things dying before they'd even had a chance to live. Barley, once strong, now bent with mildew. Rye, mottled with black fungi. Peas turned mushy before pods could swell. Even the root vegetables, hidden from view, swelled too fast and burst from waterlogged earth, soft and sour. Livestock fared no better. Sheep, those gentle bundles of wool and warmth, began dying in droves. The hay meant to sustain them had molded in the stacks. Cattle grew thin, their ribs like wooden fence posts under hide. Pigs, smart as they were, rooted desperately in swampy corners, searching for anything edible. By midsummer, panic began to sink in. Not the screaming kind of panic, but the quiet, terrifying kind that settles deep in the chest. People walked out to their fields and stared in disbelief. A year's labor gone. Monks wrote in silent horror about the ruin of the harvest. Some called it divine punishment, others a test. But none could deny that something unnatural had settled over the land. And still, it kept raining. Entire rivers swelled past their banks. Wooden bridges cracked and disappeared. Roads, already little more than muddy tracks, became impassable. Trade slowed. Carts overturned. Horses slipped. And food, what little remained, began to rise in price. In towns, millers and bakers squabbled. In villages, seed grain that should have been stored for next year's planting was eaten out of necessity. Fields were abandoned, not just because they'd failed, but because people no longer had the strength to try again. Children cried at night for bread. Mothers rationed broth. Fathers stood silent in doorways, staring out at sodden, lifeless fields. Worse yet, the harvest wasn't just poor. It was toxic. Ergot, a poisonous fungus that infects wet rye, spread rapidly. Those who ate bread made from contaminated grain experienced hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Whole families became ill. Priests were called, but could offer no answers. In monasteries, chroniclers dipped quills into ink and recorded, quietly, the worst phrases a farmer could ever read. The crops have failed. And then, the grain is gone. And still, it rained. The people didn't yet know what was coming in the winter. But in those weeks of summer, as one month blurred hopelessly into the next, they felt the first bite of something they couldn't name. A kind of dread that lived in the pit of the stomach and grew, day by day, with every soggy sunrise. This was no longer just a bad harvest. This was the beginning of Europe's great hunger. Imagine sitting at your dinner table in 1316. The air is damp with mildew, the candle barely holds a flame in the cold draught, and your stomach, empty for 2 days, is louder than your thoughts. Across the table, your youngest child stares at you, eyes sunken, lips pale. In that moment, something stirs in you, a thought you're ashamed to even think. But it's there, lurking in the corners of your mind. The famine is getting worse, and so are the people. This is where our story begins today, in the darkest corners of a starving Europe, when hunger was no longer poetic or metaphorical. It became visceral, grotesque, and for some, unspeakable. But speak of it we shall. Whispers in the villages. By the spring of 1316, the famine had moved from being just a problem of food to a problem of humanity itself. Crop failure had already stretched into a second year. It wasn't just about no bread or grain. It was about no seed left to plant, no hope to harvest. And when humans are pushed past their limits, their minds go places you'd never expect. Whispers began to circulate in the smaller villages. Stories about things people had done to survive. You know the kind. Your neighbor's cousin saw it happen, or a monk overheard it in confession. The details were foggy, but the stories were enough to chill the blood. Babies disappearing, graves being disturbed, and yes, cannibalism. It wasn't widespread, not yet, But the fear of it alone was enough to start unraveling what was left of social trust. Families stopped talking to neighbors. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Even travelers with honest intentions were often turned away, or worse, attacked on sight, assumed to be roaming scavengers looking for vulnerable targets. And the church? Well, the church was overwhelmed. Pews filled with panic. You see, in medieval Europe, the church wasn't just a place for prayers and hymns. It was the internet, the therapist's office, the town hall, and the science center all rolled into one. And when people didn't understand what was happening, they flocked to the pews for answers. Priests reported record attendance. That sounds great, until you realize why they were there. To beg, to confess, to cry, to panic. Some screamed during services. Others tried to bribe their way into God's favor. And then came the flagellants, the folks who thought if they whipped themselves hard enough, maybe God would finally stop punishing them. The church initially tried to stay composed. Priests held more masses. Monks copied more psalms. But privately, they were shaken too. After all, they were starving just like everyone else. Monasteries were running out of food. Pilgrims were dying on their steps. And priests who had promised spiritual salvation, well, they didn't know how to explain God letting a baby starve in its mother's arms. Some started preaching apocalyptic warnings. This, they said, was the end, the last judgment. Revelation, chapter and verse. The earth groaned, and the faithful listened, not because they wanted to, but because everything else had failed. A desperate solution, theft and execution. Now, let's not forget how the human survival instinct kicks in when morality fades. Theft was skyrocketing across Europe. Not petty theft, but large-scale looting, especially from churches and nobles. Entire grain stores were raided by angry mobs. Farmers hoarded seed under floorboards like treasure. Mothers taught their children to steal before they taught them to pray. Authorities tried to restore order, but law enforcement in the 14th century wasn't exactly CSI level. When a thief was caught, punishment was swift and brutal. Executions, especially hangings, increased dramatically. In France, there were towns where the gallows were busier than the bakeries. But even that didn't stop the crimes. Why? Because the people being executed had already accepted death. For many, it was a choice between starving slowly or dying with a full stomach and a noose around their neck. If you think that's chilling, hold tight. It gets worse. The stolen dead. With burial practices collapsing under the weight of so many deaths, and graveyards overflowing, the lines between the living and the dead began to blur. Literally. There are records, quiet, shameful records, of bodies being stolen from shallow graves. Some for meat, others for clothing or shoes. Even bone broth became a whispered commodity. We don't often think of the dead as part of famine economics, but in 1316, death had a resale value. This wasn't some wild, barbaric chaos. It was slow, sorrowful, and methodical. People weren't monsters. They were just broken, bent under hunger, under hopelessness, under the weight of rain that never stopped and soil that refused to yield. One mother was found boiling nettles and straw to make a sort of green soup. Another, in Belgium, reportedly gave birth and died minutes later. The neighbors didn't even bother knocking to help. They were too weak to lift the latch. The decomposition of dignity. What's astonishing is how quickly dignity decays when desperation takes over. People started to trade things once considered sacred. Relics, heirlooms, even wedding rings. Entire family legacies were given away for a loaf of bread. Marriage rates dropped. Not because people didn't want to fall in love, but because they couldn't afford to feed a spouse, let alone a family. And child abandonment. Well, it's painful to even speak of it. But there are records of children left at the doors of convents, monasteries, or, more heartbreakingly, in the woods, with a faint hope that someone else might find them and care for them. And the silence that followed in those forests, it must have been deafening. When rain is the enemy. One of the cruel ironies of the Great Famine was that it wasn't caused by drought, but by too much rain. For 2 years straight, it rained in ways Europe hadn't seen in generations. The kind of rain that flooded everything. Fields, roads, cellars, even tombs. The fields rotted. Livestock drowned. Wooden homes crumbled. Even salt, used to preserve meat, became too wet to function. Fish spoiled in brine barrels. Meat turned black within days. No one wanted to eat raw grain, but by 1316, people were grinding wet rye into a grey paste and baking it into bricks so dense they broke teeth. Some started to hallucinate from fungal toxins in the spoiled grain. Ergot poisoning, they call it today. The same fungus that would, centuries later, be linked to the Salem witch trials. So yeah, things were literally cursed. Nature stops caring. It wasn't just the crops. The forests thinned out as people chopped down trees not just for firewood, but to make shelters, carts, even cooking tools. With animals dying and wild game disappearing, even the natural world stopped offering its usual backup plan. Herbalists found that certain plants had stopped growing. Bees vanished. And fish. The rivers ran muddy and bloated. The idea of fishing as salvation was no longer on the table, because the fish weren't. Nature, it seemed, had gone rogue. Or worse, it had given up. The moral weather. By now, you're probably wondering how people even made it through this. The truth is, many didn't. Millions died. But those who survived weren't the same people they were before. Some lost faith. Others gained it. Some hardened into stone-cold pragmatists. Others turned to mysticism, believing that visions, ghosts, and omens were everywhere. Every coughing child, every cawing crow, every dark cloud meant something. In a very real way, the famine changed not just how people ate or worked, it changed how they thought. About life, about death, about the divine. The psychological weather became as chaotic as the actual storm clouds. It's worth pausing here to ask yourself, what would you do in their place? If your family was starving, your church was silent, and the law offered only hangings and rumors, what would you become? Would you stay you? The beginning of an ending. As 1316 came to a close, the hunger hadn't ended, but something had changed. People no longer believed help was coming. Instead of waiting, they began adapting. New farming methods, crop changes, desperate trades, odd alliances. The madness had peaked, and now came the long, slow collapse. But that's a story for the next chapter. If you're still with us, thank you. It means a lot to journey through history's darkest tunnels with someone thoughtful like you. Comment below. What would you have done in 1316 if your village began whispering about cannibalism? And if you're finding this story as unsettling and fascinating as we are, hit that like button and subscribe for more strange, shadowy journeys through the past. Picture this. The rain has not stopped for nearly 2 years. The skies remain heavy and grey like a woolen blanket that forgot how to lift. Outside city walls, the roads are mud pits. Inside the walls, things aren't much better. Now, imagine yourself walking into one of Europe's cities in the year 1316. The streets, usually bustling with merchants shouting prices and children chasing carts, are eerily quiet. The air smells of wet stone, rot, and desperation. There are fewer animals in the streets. No birds, no dogs, no pigs. Why? Because they've already been eaten. This is not just a food shortage anymore. This is urban unraveling. A city's heart starts to starve. Cities in the early 14th century were like organisms. They needed a steady supply of food, water, and order to function. But in 1315 and 1316, the arteries that fed them, rural farmlands and trade routes, were clogged with mud, famine, and chaos. And so, like any body denied its lifeblood, cities began to break down. Markets that once overflowed with grain, cheese, eggs, and salted meat now held only wilted greens, foraged roots, and sometimes nothing at all. Bakers locked their doors. Brewers had no barley. Millers stood by silent grinding stones. Even the rats grew thin. Worse still, prices exploded. If you could even find a loaf of bread, it might cost you the equivalent of several days' wages. People traded clothes, shoes, or tools just for a bowl of porridge. If you had silver, it no longer fed you, it just bought you time. And then, crime crept in like mold on a damp wall. Bread riots and street wars. In city after city, London, Paris, Cologne, anger began to rise alongside hunger. Crowds formed around bakeries at dawn, hoping for crumbs. Rumors of hidden grain hoards spread. Soon, riots erupted. In Ghent, Belgium, the city watch was overwhelmed by mobs looting warehouses, attacking grain carts, and even raiding churches rumored to store emergency food. In some places, city officials were dragged from their homes and forced to explain why they hadn't solved the hunger. Imagine the mayor of a medieval town, cloaked in fur and ceremony, suddenly pelted with turnips, or whatever passed for turnips that season. In London, people broke into the king's granaries, not out of rebellion, but out of pure desperation. There was no revolution in the air, just rumbling stomachs and mothers holding crying babies. And the worst part, there was no hoard, there was no secret stash. Just the truth. The food had run out, and nobody knew how to make it come back. When sanitation fails, so does society. Let's take a moment to peek inside a medieval house. You're in a cramped two-room home near the Thames. The walls are wattle and daub, basically sticks covered in clay and straw. The family of 6 that lives here has no fireplace food to cook. Their chamber pot is full, and the local latrine is overflowing. Now multiply that by hundreds of homes in just one city block. As famine tightened its grip, urban sanitation collapsed. With no proper garbage disposal or waste systems, people dumped refuse in the streets or into rivers already swollen and filthy from unending rains. Diseases that had once been manageable, like dysentery, typhoid, or trench mouth, turned deadly. The line between hunger and illness blurred. Malnourished bodies couldn't fight even the simplest infections. Hospitals, run mostly by monasteries or local orders, overflowed. Their remedies, often wine, honey, or herbs, were in short supply, and their staff, many of whom took vows of care, began dying too. It was not just a famine anymore. It was an unraveling of daily life, the death of trust. You might think, okay, but what about leadership? Didn't city officials or kings do something? Well, about that. Local officials, church leaders, and even monarchs were seen as failing, not necessarily through malice, but through sheer helplessness. What does a town mayor do when there are no merchants to supply food? What can a bishop preach when his own flock is starving in the pews? Worse yet, those in power still ate, and that was a fatal sin in the eyes of the people. When word got out that nobles were holding feasts while commoners chewed bark, it didn't spark revolution, but it did kill something more insidious: trust. City councils that had once been respected were now whispered about in alleys. Priests who offered sermons on God's mercy were met with glares. After all, if God was merciful, why were babies dying of hunger in the church steps? A creeping bitterness set in, and from that bitterness came rumors of witches, demons, poisoned wells, or divine punishment. The city wasn't just physically breaking down. Mentally, spiritually, morally, it was decaying. Cannibalism in the gutter. Let's tread carefully here. But yes, there are scattered, horrifying reports of cannibalism during the Great Famine. Some were likely exaggerated, tales spun by traumatized minds or later chroniclers hungry for drama. But others are more chillingly specific. In certain towns, corpses vanished quickly from the streets. Parents were rumored to have smothered infants rather than watch them starve. Some travelers spoke of inns where a stew's meat tasted suspicious. Others whispered that executioners sold more than bodies to doctors. Whether all true or not, these stories reflected a terrifying reality. People were thinking the unthinkable. When your city no longer protects its weakest, when law breaks down and food is memory, you enter a mental space where normal rules no longer apply. And that's when the social fabric tears completely. Children left behind. Of all the tragedies, one of the most heartbreaking was the fate of children. Many were orphaned when their parents starved or fled. Others were abandoned, left in churchyards or poorhouses with the hope someone else, anyone, might feed them. In some cities, streets were lined with begging children, hands outstretched, eyes hollow. Some tried to form small gangs, stealing what they could. Others simply curled in doorways and waited. There are letters from this time, actual accounts, where priests described hearing no laughter for weeks. Imagine that. A city once alive with games and songs suddenly silent of children's joy. That silence would haunt even the toughest city guards. A pause in the madness. By late 1317, the rains had slowed. A few brave traders began returning to the cities. Grain shipments trickled in from better-faring regions like Castile or Hungary. But the damage was done. Half the population in some cities was gone, dead, fled, or forever changed. Trade would take years to return to normal. The church had lost face. Trust in government had crumbled. Many towns entered the next decade with new walls, but fewer babies. And in the silence that followed, a new kind of fear took root. If this could happen once, could it happen again? Cities after the storm. The post-famine city was like a shell-shocked soldier, twitchy, guarded, and afraid to dream. People hoarded food more often. Laws about grain prices grew stricter. Churches emphasized charity. City councils built new granaries and enforced better hygiene. In some places, soup kitchens appeared, rudimentary, but life-saving. The idea that society could break, utterly, terrifyingly, was now part of public memory. Cities would rise again, of course. Markets would bustle. Songs would return. But the scars ran deep. You could still see them in the careful way people watched the sky, or the hush that fell when someone mentioned the bad years. Let's begin this chapter by lighting a candle. Picture a gloomy stone cathedral somewhere in northern France. Its stained glass windows are dull from soot. The priests chant softly, but the echo feels hollow. Outside, barefoot peasants kneel in the mud, eyes lifted, hands clasped, lips cracked from days without food. They are begging, not for coins, not for bread, but for a miracle. And the miracle never comes. In a time when God was believed to orchestrate everything from spring rains to the rising of the moon, the Church had enjoyed supreme authority over medieval life. But when 1315 arrived, and brought with it endless rain, mouldy crops, and dead livestock, the people began to ask questions. uncomfortable ones. If God was good, why were children dying in their mother's arms? Why were monasteries full of food, while villages starved? And perhaps most dangerous of all, if the church can't stop the rain, what is it really for? This was the beginning of a quiet rebellion, not of swords and fire, but of doubt. A soft but devastating collapse of the spiritual scaffolding that had held up medieval Europe for centuries. Let's walk through that slow, crumbling unraveling. When heaven went silent. During the famine, the church did what it always did in crisis. It ordered days of prayer, special masses, public fasts, which felt ironic when no one had eaten in days. Processions of barefoot monks walked through muddy towns, holding crosses high, chanting for divine intervention. They called for repentance, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. But nature didn't listen. The skies remained iron grey. The rain didn't stop, and people continued to die. In earlier centuries, people may have accepted this as a test of faith, or even punishment for vague sins. But this time, the suffering was so widespread, so sustained, and so senseless that people began to murmur. Why were the innocent suffering while corrupt bishops dined on pheasant? In some towns, the bells of the church rang out over empty pews. A few brave souls whispered blasphemies, not just in anger, but in despair. The church had claimed to be the voice of God. But what happens when that voice says nothing for 3 years straight? Corruption in a time of crisis. To be fair, many clergymen did try to help. Some gave up their own meals. Some monasteries opened their stores to the starving. But for every compassionate friar, there was a bishop in silk robes who raised tithes during the famine. Let's pause for a moment and talk about tithes. The church demanded 1/10 of every harvest, even during famine. It was God's share, they said. But when your whole harvest is a single sack of half-rotten barley, giving up 1/10 feels more like robbery than piety. People began to see the church not as their shepherd, but as another mouth to feed. There are records of peasants refusing to pay tithes, hiding their meager harvests, or even abandoning church services altogether. Others turned to fringe movements, heretics, mystics, visionaries. They were dangerous in the eyes of Rome, but to the hungry, they offered something new, hope without a price tag. The rise of apocalyptic thinking. With the natural order shattered and the church offering no answers, many people turned to a darker kind of faith. End times fever swept across Europe. Pamphlets predicted the second coming of Christ. Wandering prophets shouted in town squares. People blamed witches, Jews, and ungodly women for bringing God's wrath. It was easier to find a scapegoat than to admit your spiritual leaders were helpless. This kind of fear, fueled by hunger and uncertainty, led to real violence. In some regions, heretical sects burned churches and attacked priests. Others engaged in flagellation, whipping themselves in public as a way to atone for collective sins. Blood flowed in the streets, not from war, but from self-punishment. It was religious panic, not spiritual peace. The irony was crushing. The church had spent centuries cultivating obedience through promises of heavenly reward and earthly punishment. But now, as people punished themselves, the church had no control over the frenzy it had helped create. The papal silence. Meanwhile, in Avignon, where the papacy was then seated, Pope Clement V and later John XXI issued prayers and blessings from behind palace walls. But they did not open the church's granaries. They did not send fleets of wagons with food. They did not walk among the dying. The church, which had once been a source of comfort and social glue, now seemed distant and bureaucratic, closer to a government than a god. This was the beginning of a deeper rift. A few nobles quietly stopped enforcing religious mandates. Some towns saw parish priests chased out and replaced with local preachers, more charismatic than educated, more popular than obedient to Rome. Authority was fracturing, not with swords, but with silence. New voices, new faiths. Out of this spiritual vacuum came new kinds of belief. Some groups, like the Brethren of the Free Spirit, preached that every person had direct access to God, no need for priests or sacraments. Others, like the Flagellants, said that the Church had failed so completely that it was no longer holy. Even more quietly, a new idea began to take hold in some corners of Europe. Maybe the world could be explained without miracles. Maybe suffering wasn't a punishment, but just nature. This radical thought would take centuries to bloom, but the seed was planted in 1315. In a rain-soaked field, as a child buried her father with her own hands, she did not think of angels. She wondered instead why no one had come to help. Women and the cracks in the system. Interestingly, women played a quiet but pivotal role in this unraveling. In convents, nuns began writing about suffering not as divine testing, but as a result of poor leadership. Female mystics claimed visions that contradicted church doctrine, and midwives, long distrusted by the clergy, became local heroes as they comforted the dying with herbs, warmth, and human touch. They did not preach. They did not judge. They simply stayed. And that presence, of someone who didn't demand belief but offered bread, was more powerful than a dozen Latin sermons. A slow decline, not a sudden collapse. To be clear, the church didn't crumble overnight. Its buildings still stood. Its rituals continued. But its grip loosened. By the time the Black Death arrived 3 decades later, many communities already viewed their clergy with suspicion. When those same priests fled the plague, the spiritual authority of the church cracked further. And it all began with a rainstorm that wouldn't end. A world of broken trust. What's most fascinating about the collapse of church authority in 1315 isn't that people stopped believing in God. They didn't. They stopped believing in the people who claimed to speak for him. That's a quieter rebellion, harder to detect. But it changes the course of history far more than torches and pitchforks. Because when people begin to think for themselves, even if only out of desperation, new ideas take root. Science, reform, revolution. It took centuries for those seeds to grow, but they were watered first by rain, and then by doubt. So, next time you pass by a grand cathedral or see a painting of a medieval priest in golden robes, remember, there was a time when the people outside were starving, the rain was endless, and faith began to rot in the mud. And yet, from that decay, new belief systems eventually sprouted. If you're enjoying this slow unraveling of medieval Europe, give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Did you ever imagine the church's power could begin to crumble from something as simple as a soggy harvest? Let us know below. And subscribe if you're curious what happened next. Because in Chapter 7, we meet the wolves. Yes, real ones. Imagine it now. The year is 1316. The rain has not stopped. The rivers are swollen. The earth is waterlogged. The roads have melted into sticky ribbons of mud. Fields that once fed entire villages are drowning, and granaries are haunted by echoes instead of sacks of grain. And in this terrible silence of starvation, something begins to unravel. Not just bellies but behavior. This chapter is not for the faint of heart. This is the part of the story where hunger changes people. Where desperate mothers hush crying children with no milk to give. Where fathers look into empty bowls and feel the cold weight of failure. Where morality begins to slip, inch by inch, under the crushing boot of famine. Let us walk gently into this chapter, where the hungry turn savage. The breaking point. By now, most livestock had been eaten, sold, or died of starvation themselves. The cows and pigs were long gone. The chickens, too. The few sheep that survived were often too weak to stand. What was once a barnyard of bleating and clucking was now eerily still. Villagers had begun boiling leather, shoes, belts, saddle straps, anything tanned with animal fat that could release even a whisper of calories. Old manuscripts tell us that people tried to eat moss, grass, even clay. Tree bark was stripped. Roots were dug up. A kind of desperation cuisine began to appear, with recipes no one would want in a cookbook. You can almost hear the crackle of wet firewood and the weak bubble of some foul-smelling stew. Maybe it contains a boiled rat. Maybe not even that. In the cities, the poor began swarming the gates of the monasteries again, even though the monks had little left to offer. Monks were starving, too. They had sold their altar cloths. Some had given up their own meals for children. Even the wealthy began to panic. Their silver could not buy what did not exist. It was said that one noblewoman traded her jewels for a bag of spoiled grain, another for a single sack of dried peas. People were realizing that in a world without food, gold is just a pretty rock. Cannibalism in the shadows. The worst rumors began to spread like rot in the damp air. It started in whispers. "Have you heard what happened in the next village?" one might say. They say, "A man disappeared." At first, no one wanted to believe it. But soon, the whispers turned to screams. Mothers claimed their children had been stolen. Strangers vanished on forest roads. And people began locking their doors not out of fear of wolves or bandits, but of their own kind. Chroniclers of the time, those brave or haunted enough to write it down, record stories of cannibalism. Some stories may have been exaggerated, but others ring terribly true. A man in one village was burned at the stake for allegedly feeding human flesh to his family. In another town, 2 women were caught boiling a child. Were these legends, warnings, real? In a world gone upside down, it almost doesn't matter. The fear was real. The desperation was worse. And the authorities, what few remained, were overwhelmed. The price of bread, crime and riots. Markets, if they functioned at all, were scenes of chaos. Imagine walking through a market square, your stomach tight with hunger. You see a man with a tiny loaf of rye bread, selling it for the price of a cow. Another man offers onions wrapped in dirty cloth for a silver coin. And the guards? They're too busy looking for food themselves to enforce anything. Riots became more frequent. In some towns, angry mobs overturned carts, looted bakeries, and raided noble homes. Justice, once a concept upheld by priests and kings, was now handed out by hunger and fury. A woman caught with stolen apples might have her hands cut off. A boy hoarding bread could be hanged. In many places, justice broke down entirely. The rule of law was now the law of survival. Strangers in the fields. As entire villages collapsed under the weight of famine, refugees began to roam the countryside. Bands of gaunt men, their clothes soaked with rain and their eyes hollow with hunger, wandered from town to town. They begged, they stole, and sometimes they simply died by the roadside. Travelers became feared. A knock on the door after dark sent shivers through families. Was it a stranger looking for food, or a thief, or something worse? Villages began to isolate themselves. They dug ditches, raised fences, armed themselves with pitchforks and clubs. The very fabric of trust, between neighbor and neighbor, town and traveler, was torn to rags. The toll on children. Children, above all, bore the cruelest scars. With no milk from mothers and no gruel from kitchens, infants died in droves. One chronicle from Flanders claimed that children were buried in mass graves, sometimes by the hundreds. Another account described children too weak to cry, simply fading away in their mother's arms. The survivors grew up stunted, both in body and mind. Malnutrition in the first years of life leads to long-term cognitive damage. Generations born during the famine were smaller, frilier, and more prone to illness. One could say the famine ended lives, but it also twisted those it didn't kill. Communities turn inward. Religious processions marched through muddy streets, pleading with the heavens. But in many places, faith curdled into fear. Witches were blamed. Foreigners were accused. Strange crops or odd-colored animals were seen as omens. One story from Bohemia tells of a woman burned at the stake because she had a garden that grew when others didn't. Perhaps she had secretly fertilized it. Or perhaps she had just been lucky. Either way, luck was dangerous in a starving world. Even within families, things turned dark. There were reports of parents abandoning children, siblings fighting over crusts of bread, people too weak to bury their dead, leaving bodies to decay indoors. And still, the rain kept falling. Wolves returned to the villages. With fewer humans around to guard the boundaries, nature began to reclaim the land. Wolves came down from the hills, no longer afraid. They prowled the edges of towns, howling in the night. Bears rooted through abandoned barns. Wild dogs, once pets, now ran in packs. One priest in Normandy wrote that he saw a wolf dragging the body of a child. Another wrote of fields so quiet that he could hear the worms in the soil. It was as though the earth itself had sighed and turned its back on humanity. A world on edge. By the end of 1316, Europe looked like a bruised, starving continent. People had eaten everything that could be eaten. Fields lay drowned. The church had failed to stop the suffering. The kings had nothing to offer. And the people were no longer just farmers, or weavers, or blacksmiths. They were survivors. They had begged. They had wept. Some had stolen. Some had killed. And some had buried more loved ones than they could count. But still, they endured. Somehow. What do you think you'd do in a world without food? Would your village come together, or fall apart? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're still with us on this journey through history's darkest famine, leave a bread emoji below. Now we move into the psychological aftermath. How those who lived through the famine were forever changed, and how Europe was never quite the same again. What does survival do to a people? Join us for the long hunger, trauma that wouldn't die. The candles are lit. The fire is low. Outside, a mist has settled over the village paths, muffling even the footsteps of the night watchman. So close your eyes or soften your gaze, as we drift now into Chapter 8, into a darker corner of the famine story, the rise of the scapegoats. It always happens, doesn't it? When the skies refuse to shine, when crops wither or rot, when bellies hollow out and hope thins like gruel, people look for someone to blame. In medieval Europe, this need for blame wasn't just emotional. It was spiritual, existential. If a field flooded, it wasn't just bad luck. It was the wrath of God, or perhaps the work of someone unnatural. And thus, in the hollow years of 1316 and 1317, as the Great Famine continued to gnaw through the land, fear turned sideways, into suspicion, into paranoia, into punishment. Let's begin with the easiest target, the outsider. Candle, the stranger among us. Imagine, if you will, a muddy village in northern France. The people are starving. Their thatch-roof cottages smell of mildew and damp straw, and their children cry through the night from hunger. Into this misery arrives a traveller, Maybe he's a merchant, maybe a wandering friar, maybe just a man looking for shelter. But he speaks with a strange accent, or wears a coat stitched in an unfamiliar style. What do you think happened? In many cases, that man would be chased off. But in the worst, he might be accused of poisoning wells, of casting curses, of angering God simply by existing where he didn't belong. There were reports, scattered through local chronicles, of such travelers being beaten, jailed, or simply disappearing. Local sheriffs would sometimes be too afraid to intervene, or worse, they agreed. The idea was that suffering couldn't just happen. Someone had to cause it. And someone often meant someone not from here. Candle witches, weather, and wild accusations. Though the great witch hunts of Europe wouldn't reach their peak until the 15th and 16th centuries, seeds were already being sown during the famine years. People began whispering about women who gathered herbs in the woods, or those who kept cats, or women who knew a bit too much about healing, or spoke too confidently when the rains wouldn't stop. In some German towns, widows and spinsters were blamed for the failed harvests. In one case, a healer was beaten to death after she was accused of stealing the sun. These aren't just legends. They're recorded in manorial records and letters of the time. You see, people couldn't understand the weather. The church told them everything had divine purpose. And if the floods weren't stopping and the animals were drowning, maybe, just maybe, some woman had made a pact with dark forces. This wasn't just superstition. It was survival logic twisted by desperation. If you could punish the right person, maybe the rains would stop. Maybe God would relent. Candle Jews and the famine precedents. The Jewish communities in Europe had long faced suspicion and persecution, but during times of famine, these tensions exploded. Now, to be clear, during the 1315 to 1317 famine itself, mass pogroms were less frequent than they would be during the Black Death years later. But the seeds of that scapegoating were already there. Why? Because Jewish communities were often involved in trade, finance, and sometimes had access to stored grain, or at least were rumored to. They were literate, they read Hebrew, they had different rituals. To a starving, frightened Christian villager, a nearby Jewish enclave might seem suspiciously untouched, even if they were suffering just as much. That's how rumors began. Some whispered that Jewish bakers were hoarding flour. Others said the Jews had foreseen the famine, as if knowledge were a kind of sorcery. Later, when famine gave way to plague in the 1340s, these whispers would become full-on violence. But already, during the famine, church sermons and town gossip laid the groundwork. Candle punishing the poorer poor. You might think the rich blamed the poor, and they did. But even among the poor, there were scapegoats, vagabonds, those who wandered from village to village begging for food, women with children but no husbands, or men who once held jobs but were now ragged and silent, eyes sunken from too many days without bread. In some towns, local beggars were accused of cursing crops. In others, they were blamed for stealing from the dead. Parish records show that beggars were whipped, cast out, even branded. One German ordinance from 1316 banned all unregistered poor from entering town gates during feast days, because their presence was considered bad luck. Imagine that. Starving people excluded by other starving people, because someone had to carry the burden of the misfortune. Candle, the devil takes the blame. The church, for its part, was at a loss. They had urged prayer, fasted, held processions in the rain. But the famine did not end. So, in their sermons, some priests shifted their focus. They blamed the devil. They blamed sorcerers. They blamed entire villages, especially those with sinful reputations. And slowly, certain places gained infamy. villages said to be cursed, towns where the famine was unnaturally bad, places where people whispered about strange lights in the sky or animals acting oddly. In one French village, a girl was burned for allegedly dancing in the churchyard during Lent, a sign, they said, that she was in league with the devil. Whether it was fear of witches, Jews, travelers, or beggars, the pattern was clear. The less people could control the famine, the more they needed to control each other. Candle, scapegoating by policy. Even kings and lords weren't immune to panic. In England, King Edward II passed laws limiting the movement of workers, blaming wage inflation on disorderly peasants rather than scarcity. In Paris, the city council briefly banned the import of foreign grain, fearing it was cursed or diseased. In parts of Bohemia, nobles blamed their serfs for not working hard enough, ignoring the obvious. The fields were flooded. The ploughs were stuck in the mud. The scapegoating trickled down from pulpits to parliaments, from tavern whispers to royal decrees, and each one, in its own way, made the famine worse. Candle, the cost of blame. All of this, the accusations, the violence, the paranoia, came at a price. Communities turned inward. Trade between villages slowed. Trust withered. Some Jews fled to Poland. Some healers gave up their work. Some widows lived in silence, afraid to speak lest they be accused. The famine didn't just kill with hunger. It killed with fear, with the slow erosion of kindness. And when, finally, the rain stopped, and the earth began to dry, and crops began, cautiously, to grow once more, not everything returned to normal. The scars of suspicion ran deep. Neighbors who had accused each other didn't forget. Communities once open to travelers locked their gates. And fear, the kind that wraps itself around your ribs and stays there, became a part of the culture. So tonight, as you lay in quiet comfort, think of this chapter not just as history, but as a reminder that in times of hardship, how we treat the most vulnerable says more about us than any disaster ever could. That the real test is not just surviving a famine, but remaining human in the middle of it. Imagine a village at the edge of a frost-bitten forest. The trees are tall, solemn, and heavy with silence. No birdsong, no crunch of boots on leaf litter, only the hush of winter and the muffled sniffles of a child, curled in the lap of her mother, who is too weak to speak. This was the reality for millions after the worst of the famine had passed. But make no mistake, hunger has a way of lingering, long after the rains subsided, long after the grain was gone, long after people stopped bothering to bury the dead. This chapter isn't just about food, it's about the ghosts it left behind. Let's lie back now, and drift into the long shadow of hunger. When you think of famine, you probably picture a year or two of bad harvests, then recovery. But the aftermath of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 wasn't tidy. It wasn't a matter of simply planting more oats and dusting off your apron. In fact, many didn't even make it to the so-called end. Because hunger isn't just a moment. It's a season, a mood, a memory that hardens the soul. Across Europe, the years that followed were heavy with the scent of trauma. People didn't return to normal life. They limped back into it, gaunt, suspicious, changed. Let's start with the body. Even when the rains finally relented and the clouds decided they'd done enough damage, the food didn't return immediately. Fields had been left untended. Livestock were gone, eaten, diseased, or stolen. Seed grain, which should have been kept for planting, had long since been baked into loaves or boiled into thin, bitter porridge. And let's not forget, the soil itself was tired. It needed rest, and yet rest was a luxury no peasant could afford. People returned to their fields like survivors crawling out of wreckage. They tried planting again, but yields remained low. Malnourished farmers produced poor crops. Poor crops meant less food. Less food meant continued hunger. And so the cycle creaked forward, broken and grinding. Now, let's talk about children. Some historians believe an entire generation was stunted by the Great Famine. Not just physically, though many were. Malnutrition warped bones, delayed puberty, weakened immune systems. But there was something else. A quiet dullness. Teachers in rural schools recorded that children seemed slow of mind, not dumb, but dimmed like lanterns with only half the oil. The hunger had burned through their bodies, yes, but also their futures, their ability to thrive, to grow, to imagine. And with childhood muted, so too was joy. No spring games, no sweet treats, just work, worry, and the constant pang of want. Even marriage, that old social glue, began to wither. In villages across England, France, and the German lands, fewer people wed in the years after the famine. What would be the point? No dowries, no bread, no faith in tomorrow. Priests lamented the rise in carnal sin, as young couples chose love without ceremony, affection without legality. But could you blame them? When you've just buried half your siblings, the difference between wedding vows and whispered promises under a hayloft seems trivial. Even childbirth declined. Mothers feared bringing a baby into a world so cruel, and those who tried often lost their little ones within days. Milk ran dry in the breasts of starving women, and midwives knew there was only so much they could do. There were whispers, too, whispers of curses, of divine wrath, of witches who had soured the land. And once again, as they always do in hard times, suspicion crept into the cracks left by famine. In some villages, the elderly were accused of hoarding food or causing crop failure with a bad eye. In others, lone women were blamed for misfortune. They were too lucky, too fat, too free. What sorcery let her keep chickens when mine all died? Witch hunts wouldn't reach their fever pitch for another few decades, but the seeds were planted here, in the lonely, starved aftermath of a hunger that never quite let go. Let's drift now to a manor house, crumbling a little at the edges. Even the wealthy weren't immune to famine's shadow. True, they'd had more to eat during the worst of it, but their servants were gone, their rents unpaid, their labourers dead or weak. What good was a full pantry if you had no one to harvest your apples or bake your bread? Some nobles began to barter their status for resources. Horses were traded for sacks of rye. Silver goblets pawned for oxen. Pride bowed to necessity. Others turned to violence. In parts of Scotland and the Low Countries, minor lords raided nearby villages under pretexts of debt or loyalty to a rival king. But really, it was just hunger dressed up in armor. And let's not forget the animals. Fewer oxen meant fewer plows. Fewer horses meant less transport. Cats and dogs had long since vanished from the streets, eaten mostly. But now even birds grew scarce. The forests, overhunted during the famine, were eerily quiet. Even wild boar, those thick-skinned beasts that once roamed freely, seemed to vanish. Nature, too, had pulled back, wounded by man's desperation. There is something haunting about empty bells. In many towns, church bells stopped ringing after the famine, not because of a lack of faith, but because there were no hands left to pull the ropes, no ears left to hear the sound. Churchyards, once tidy, grew over with weeds. Wooden crosses sagged. Names were forgotten. The famine, you see, didn't just kill people. It buried memory. It stole the songs of grandmothers, the fishing tricks of old men, the lullabies of mothers who never got to pass them on, and perhaps most chilling of all, people forgot what it was like to feel full. Imagine that. Years pass. The harvests recover. Bread is baked. Ale is brewed. Cattle return to the meadows. But still, you take only a little. Still, you save the crust for tomorrow. Still, your belly clenches when you hear thunder, when you see a black cloud on the horizon. Because hunger, once learned, becomes part of you. A muscle memory. A quiet panic that never quite fades. The long shadow of hunger wasn't just physical. It was generational. A grandmother, decades later, might still slice apples thin to make them last. A father might still hoard crusts under his bed, just in case. Children might be scolded for wasting broth, not because food was scarce now, but because once it had vanished completely. So what does this mean for us? We, who sleep with refrigerators humming, who toss leftovers and click order again without much thought. The story of the Great Famine reminds us not just of what was lost, but what was learned. Communities began to store seed grain more carefully. Some towns built granaries that belonged to all, not just the Lord. Innovations in crop rotation and drainage, spurred by desperation, would quietly shape future centuries. Even in its cruelty, hunger left behind lessons. And like all good stories, especially the old, hard ones, they live on in whispers, in the quiet moments, in the shadows. So as you rest now, with the soft hum of your world all around you, think of them. The girl who scraped the last bowl clean. The old man who planted beans in the frozen mud, just in case. The mother who sang lullabies to sleep away the pangs of hunger. They are not so far from us. Their stories breathe through time, and their shadows remind us. Resilience is sometimes just another word for hunger carried well. Sleep well now, and when you wake, eat slowly, with gratitude, because somewhere, someone once starved so we wouldn't have to. Imagine a world that had learned from its mistakes. Imagine if, after all the suffering, all the hollowed-out villages, the starving children, the desperate sermons from ailing priests, Europe had made sweeping changes, systems redesigned, fields diversified, granaries reinforced. But what if it didn't? Let's close this journey not just by peering into the past, but by gently walking along the shadow it still casts. The famine of 1315 to 1317 wasn't just a temporary hiccup in the medieval timeline. It was a generational wound, one that echoed quietly for decades to come. Let's light one last lantern and step carefully into the final chapter. It was over. The rains eventually stopped. The sun began to return, shy at first, peeking from behind sullen clouds. Crops, though reluctant, began to grow again. Livestock herds were rebuilt, slowly. The streets smelled less like decay and more like smoke from hearths, a sign that people were cooking again. But make no mistake, this was not a triumphant return to abundance. Those who survived the famine were changed. Their bodies were thinner, weaker, their spirits more cautious, more fearful. An entire generation of children had grown up with hunger as their lullaby. Those born after the worst years had parents who hoarded food under their beds, who flinched at the sound of distant thunder, as if the skies would once again turn traitor. And the landscape of Europe, both literal and social, had been altered in ways few could have foreseen. The memory that faded too fast. You might think a catastrophe like this would live on in song, story, and scripture for centuries. But strangely, it didn't. Unlike the Black Death that followed in 1347, the Great Famine of 1315 did not become a mythologized trauma. It didn't inspire great poems or sprawling artworks. It left few visible scars. Why? Perhaps because it was slow, painfully, soul-numbingly slow. A creeping death, not a dramatic one. It starved people, quietly, without the spectacle of plague carts or bleeding buboes. And in a society where every day was already a battle against scarcity, perhaps it just didn't feel unusual enough to be remembered. But oh, it should have been. Because famine, unlike disease, can be prevented. And that's what makes forgetting it so dangerous. What they could have learned, but didn't. Lesson 1. Don't rely on a single crop. Medieval farmers planted what had worked for decades: oats, wheat, barley, but they rarely diversified. No one thought to plant turnips or beans as a hedge against disaster. There were no Plan Bs. Even after the famine, this changed only slowly. The idea of a resilient agricultural system wouldn't catch on for centuries. Lesson 2. Centralized grain storage. You'd think, after nearly every village lost its food supply, that massive efforts would be made to create storage systems, emergency reserves, regional granaries. Some areas tried, but on the whole, efforts were localized, fragmented, and quickly abandoned once things returned to normal. Lesson 3. Don't ignore the poor. The famine hit hardest not because there wasn't any food, but because the poor couldn't afford the little that was left. The rich ate better than ever. But Europe had no true system for redistribution, no social safety net. Not then, not for a very long time. And yet, the structures stayed the same. Nobles kept taxing grain even when there was no grain. Kings kept demanding labor even when there was no strength left to give. The shift that did happen, but not all lessons were lost. Something subtle stirred. Something important. A questioning. Before the famine, people believed that everything happened for a divine reason. If your cow died, you had sinned. If the harvest failed, you hadn't prayed hard enough. The church was the ultimate interpreter of these events. But the famine revealed something deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes you could do everything right and still starve. This cracked the foundation of the church's authority, not with a bang, but with a slow, spreading fracture. People still went to Mass. They still crossed themselves and whispered prayers. But deep inside, many began to wonder, is God listening? And if He is, why does He let this happen? This shift, this interior rebellion, would eventually blossom into something much bigger: the Reformation, the Renaissance, new thinking, new questioning. But it started here, quietly, in the muddy fields and broken bellies of a starving land. The famine behind the scenes. What's most astonishing is how little it takes for civilization to buckle. Just a few years of bad weather. Just one transport route disrupted. Just one merchant hoarding grain. The 1315 famine wasn't caused by a war, or an empire collapsing, or a new deadly disease. It was caused by clouds, by water, by rot. That's all it took. And yet, kings fell. Populations shrank. Entire villages disappeared. Cultural confidence was shaken. It's a chilling thought, even now. Civilization is always thinner than it looks. Echoes into today. Here's where things get truly eerie. In 2020, we watched global supply chains teeter under the weight of a virus. In parts of the world today, famine still looms, not because there's no food, but because of distribution failures, war, politics, and yes, weather. Climate change echoes the patterns of 1315, with floods, droughts, and crop failures already appearing in global headlines. Have we learned from the past? Or are we just modern people in fancier clothes, crossing our fingers and hoping the clouds behave? The famine of 1315 is more than a historical footnote. It's a whisper from the past, asking us to look around and ask, are we ready? A final quiet thought. Tonight, as you fall asleep, warm and full, maybe with the soft hum of a fan or the faint glow of a bedside lamp. Think of a peasant family, huddled in a sod hut 7 centuries ago. Rain leaking through the thatch. No food in the pot. A child crying, too weak to even open its eyes. Then imagine that same child surviving, growing older, remembering, and choosing to tell their story to anyone who would listen. That child lives on, in diaries, in soil records, in the fragile parchments of forgotten chronicles. And tonight, in you. Because by remembering the famine, by whispering its lessons across time, we keep the forgotten from vanishing completely. And maybe, just maybe, we stay one step ahead of the clouds. If this journey through the hunger years of 1315 moved you, share it with someone who loves forgotten history. What's one thing you would have done to survive in a world without food? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that gentle bell icon for more stories that bring the past back to life. Sleep well, traveler, and may your pantry always be full.